Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. It is great to see all of you. I'm excited because what I want to do is I want to take you on a trip around the world with me for the next 30 minutes. And what I want to do is see if we can't together try to, if not solve, at least chip away at a mystery. And it's an important mystery, and it's ultimately a hopeful mystery. This mystery is one that we've all heard about over the years, and I heard about it too as a reporter. I kept hearing like this background noise about these countries that allegedly educated virtually all their kids to high levels of critical thinking in math, reading, and science, where all the children were brilliant and the parents were super and the teachers were perfect. And I couldn't quite believe it. You know, I kept hearing about this. And I kind of tuned it out for a while because I felt like, well, you know, the United States is a big, diverse country with a significant amount of child poverty. And so to compare us to, say, Finland or Korea doesn't really make sense. And that worked for a while. And then I started thinking, what, since states and locals mostly fund and to some degree run education, what if we thought about states as countries? So what if we imagined that the United States was actually 50 different countries, which in some ways, sometimes it feels like it is, right? 50 very different countries that don't necessarily get along. And when you do that, and you look at research comparing the performance of 10th graders in math around the world, you see some interesting things. So one interesting thing is, I've chosen math in particular because I don't want to exaggerate. I think that math is clearly a weakness for the United States and many countries. And it's a weakness at all socioeconomic levels and at all ages. We do better in reading, especially in the early years. So this, again, is hopeful, and it's important not to overstate the case. We are performing average for the developed world in reading and below average in math. So I've focused here on math for that reason. And you see some interesting things, right? I mean, you do see one country in blue, which would be the highest performing tier, one state rather, in blue, which would be the highest performing tier in the world, which is Massachusetts, which is encouraging. But then you wonder, why aren't there more blue states? I'm not saying the whole country, right? But if you look, let's say, at a state like Maine. Maine has a quarter of the population of Finland, and it's 94% white. So whatever Maine's challenges are, and there are challenges, diversity is not one of them, I think we can safely say. And yet, its teenagers are performing at the level of Portugal. And all over the country, despite the fact that we spend more on K through 12 education per pupil than all but 4 countries in the world, we are not getting the kind of returns that you would expect, given all the heart and time and policy change that we've poured into this subject. So I decided to stop everything else I was doing and spend a year traveling around the world trying to get beyond the data, which was really interesting, but actually see what it was like to be a kid in these countries, because that was the part that I was having trouble understanding. And also to try to understand how these countries got that way. Because one of the most encouraging facts about this subject is that none of these countries were that smart 50 years ago. So something had changed, some of them even over the past 10 years. And that, to me, was really exciting, to see that change is possible and actually happening all around the world. So what I want to do is introduce you to 3 American teenagers that I followed for 1 year. Because I knew from my reporting in the United States that unless I talked to kids, I was going to be off in my own little world imagining what I thought was true. And if I talked to actual students, I always get a level of granular reality, if you know what I mean, that I can never get on my own or talking to all the adults in the building and in the community, which I have to do as well. But luckily, there are every year 30,000 teenagers who essentially switch places, who either come to the United States to live with a host family and attend public high school for a year, or leave the United States to do the same abroad. And these students are like this incredible untapped resource. You know, they are truly amateur anthropologists. They have strong opinions about what they see at home and abroad. They don't necessarily understand the full picture, but they can understand in a very deep and profound way how one school and home and neighborhood looked back in the US compared to how one school and home and neighborhood looked to them in another country. So the first person I'd like to introduce you to is Eric. Eric is from Minnesota, right after Massachusetts, one of the highest performing states in the country. And within Minnesota, he was very fortunate to attend a well-resourced suburban high school, beautiful facilities. And within that school, he attended the International Baccalaureate track. So Eric was basically living in pretty much the best we have to offer, educationally speaking. Came from an intact home, had lots of opportunities, did drama, worked very hard in high school. And at some point, he heard about exchange programs through his school. And he was kind of burnt out, of school. And he decided that he wanted to take a year off, and go on an exchange program. And so he went from Minnesota to probably the worst place in the world to take a year off. And I apologize, the slides were originally black, so you can't see that very well, but I'll read it to you. He went to South Korea. He went to South Korea, which is the absolute last place you'd like to go on an academic break, just so you know. Because South Korea is sort of the extreme version of a model that we might call the pressure cooker model. South Koreans score at the top of the world again and again on all manner of international tests. But the path to getting to that point, that pinnacle, is grueling. And that is something that Eric would soon discover. And then we have Kim. Kim is from Oklahoma. And in many ways, it was like Kim was living in a different country than Eric. Kim is from rural Oklahoma. She was attending a school that was majority low-income students, majority of whom had Native American ancestry. And she had never left the United States. She had a single mother who was a teacher, in fact. But she never quite felt connected to her school. Like a lot of American schools, football was at the heart of the place, football and basketball. And she did try, to her credit, she tried to find her place in that community. And so she wanted to be a cheerleader, starting in kindergarten. And she tried, and this is adorable little yellow cheerleading uniform. But she was terrified doing a cartwheel. And it turns out you pretty much hit a ceiling by third grade in cheerleading if you can't do a cartwheel. So that was it for her. So then she decided to join the marching band. And she took up the flute. And she tried, and she tried, and she tried. But she was assigned like sixth chair in the band. And it's not a big band, you know what I'm saying? So she was having real trouble with the flute. And she tried different things. But what she really wanted was she wanted to see the world. And she read about different countries, and she heard about exchange programs from her sister. And she thought that was for rich people. That wasn't for her. But she started Googling around, as kids will do, and she started fantasizing. And she read that Finland had the smartest kids in the world. And she read they had really strong coffee and a good sense of humor. And the more she read, the more she fell in love with this place that she knew almost nothing about. And she told her mom, "Mom, I want to go spend a year studying and living in Finland." And her mom did something very, very important here. She'd found that if you say flat out no to Kim, you run into a battle, right? She's a teenager. She was 15 at the time. So instead, she called her bluff. She said, well, if you can raise the $10,000 that you need to go on an exchange program for a year, then you're welcome to go. So Kim spent all of her freshman year in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, raising $10,000 to go to Finland. She held a bake sale outside the local supermarket, which she soon discovered was not a very lucrative endeavor. She realized she'd have to hold about 100 of them if she was ever going to get to Finland. So then she started selling beef jerky door to door, which turned out to be shockingly profitable, actually. I recommend it. And then she created a blog and asked strangers for money, got some donations, and she wrote to all of the addresses, all the businesses in her Chamber of Commerce list and asked for sponsorships. And no one responded. But here, I'm glad someone brought up grit, because here's what this girl did. She didn't quit. She kept going. And sometimes she thought it was like a joke, like something she was just doing to say she'd tried, and she never thought she would get there. But eventually, she got a couple of scholarships, and she got lucky on a couple things, and her grandparents helped her out. And she raised $10,000 to go to Finland. So I like this story for many reasons, but what I love about it the most is this is a story about an American girl. An American girl who wants to see the world and won't quit. So, because God has a sense of humor, Kim goes from rural Oklahoma to being placed in rural Finland, again with a single mother, interestingly, who has 2 5-year-old girls, and off she goes on her first transatlantic flight. Next, we have Tom. Tom is from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and he is the kind of kid who is just kind of quietly stubborn, you know what I mean? Like, he just likes to do his own thing. So he grows up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but he refuses to play with Civil War soldiers and is only interested in World War II as a little boy. Gettysburg. I mean, if you walk through the street, you're tripping over Civil War soldier figurines. I mean, it's like all around you. And he starts playing the cello, and he starts reading Chekhov, and he's into Woody Allen films, and he listens to Sonic Youth. And he's just living a little bit outside the margins of Gettysburg culture. And he gets really fascinated with Eastern Europe, and he decides that it would be really awesome if he could spend a year living in Eastern Europe. And he has this idea that if he could get to Poland, then maybe he could spend his afternoons reading philosophy in smoke-filled coffee shops. And that is exactly what Tom does. He goes on an exchange program to Wrocław, Poland, from Pennsylvania, and he literally reads philosophy in smoke-filled coffee shops. And I went and visited him, and he took me to one of the coffee shops, and I was like, wow, this is really smoky, seriously. I forgot. This is something I forgot about with all the bans going on in the US on smoking. So off we go. We have our 3 students. They're the boots on the ground. They're my fixers. They're my translators in some cases. They're my connections to all kinds of people. And the best part of this is that I ended up really parachuting into random schools, because if you go through the Ministry of Education, they'll take you on these official choreographed junkets they take reporters on to some kind of beautiful school that is not representative of the country. We do that too, of course, when other reporters come here. So, what did these kids learn? Well, it was so interesting. I mean, I honestly was blown away. I knew that they would be, the reason I did this was because I thought it would help make the book more interesting and more useful. But they became the protagonists of the book. They were so insightful and thoughtful and honest and non-ideological and downright blunt sometimes about the things they liked and the things they didn't like and what they would change from one country to the next, that I ended up surveying hundreds of exchange students to see if there were patterns in what they were telling me. And there were. So I want to share just a few of the lessons that they learned on this adventure. One thing they learned was the most maybe obvious. Maybe on the first day of school. And it was really an aesthetic realization. Because what they found in Finland and Korea and Poland, 3 very different countries, was that their schools were not super impressive to look at, let's say. So, for example, Tom's school in Poland had not only no interactive digital whiteboards, no smartboards, but not a cafeteria even, okay? It didn't have the state-of-the-art theater that his high school back in Gettysburg had, or the laptop carts that his classrooms had. And this is a picture of Eric's school in Korea. This is the field, right? This was also different, and something the kids noticed on the first day. That sports was, of course, really an afterthought, especially in high school as kids were approaching decisions about college and careers. So sports in most of the world is not part of school. Kids play sports, but it's not part of what a principal has to worry about, which allows for a lot more focus, right? And it's something that, again, I probably wouldn't have really noticed, but the kids really noticed it. And when I surveyed hundreds of exchange students, 9 out of 10 international students said that Americans placed a great deal more importance on sports, American kids. And American exchange students agreed. They also said, a majority, 7 out of 10, said they saw more technology in their US classrooms, which also surprised me. But this was something, again, that speaks to many things, some good, some bad. But one is that in these countries, school was about school. And while there's not good international data on relative investments in technology and education, anecdotally, people who have visited lots of random schools around the world will tell you that you don't tend to see the kinds of shiny objects that you see in many of our schools. Some of which do great things, and some of which sit in boxes, some of which break, and some of which, all of which, cost a lot of money. So you begin to get little clues about where we're spending our money compared to some other countries. So what I want to do now is actually let Tom talk for himself for 1 minute, because I think it is really important to hear from students directly. And he's going to talk very briefly about why he decided to leave his school in Pennsylvania for a year, what it was like there, particularly with regards to technology. And then he's going to talk very briefly about what it was like in Poland. So we can go ahead and roll tape for the Tom video, please.
Basically, high school just was kind of a stagnant environment for me. Well, I mean, what was important in high school? It's like prom, football games, dating people, and there was no one wanted to actually learn anything, and no one wanted to discover the world or something. I think high school could definitely be more engaging, and but it's not a question of how much technology we have in the classroom, of whether we have iPads and laptops, because all of my classes we do have laptops, and in all of my classes we use smartboards. And what do kids do on their laptops? They play flash games, and smartboards don't work all the time, and if they do, then you're not doing anything that you wouldn't do on a chalkboard. The classroom's a much more sober environment. There's no joking around between student and teacher like there is in America. And there's certainly no talking back, and there's no conflict in class.
So he said a lot of things there, but I want to pause on one, which was, he said it was a sober environment. This is something that comes up a lot when you talk to exchange students who come here, who go abroad. And it's not all good news, of course. I mean, in fact, one of our great strengths, if you look at our performance compared to other countries, is that students in America have more positive feelings towards their teachers. They feel like their teachers care about them. There's more interaction in the classrooms on average. In fact, 89% of American 15-year-olds say that their teacher cares about their well-being, compared to 15% in Japan. When I surveyed exchange students, many of them said on their own, to the open-ended questions I asked, how much they liked their American teachers, how different it was, that their teacher actually spoke to them and wanted to hear them speak back. You heard this especially from kids who were coming from places like Germany, Italy, Spain. So you can have a very rigid, hierarchical culture, obviously, in school, and there are pros and cons to that, right? But we know that for 21st century skills, it is important that sometimes kids be allowed to speak. So this is a great strength of the American system, particularly when combined with rigorous learning. And that leads us to another point that Tom noticed in Poland. On his first week of school there, the teacher read out the results of the latest test. And in Poland, the top grade was a 5, like an A, and the worst grade was a 1. And she read out there was a 1, and a couple 2s, and some 3s and 4s, and no one got a 5. So all year long, Tom listened to hear a 5 every time the teacher read the results of the test. And no one ever got a 5. And this blew Tom's mind, because that would never have happened in Gettysburg. But the weirdest thing is, every time after they announced the grades, the kids, shouldered their backpacks and went to their next class. They didn't seem psychologically devastated the way that he thought they might be. And this is something we know is true across the country. American 15-year-olds rank #1 in the world for the percentage who say they routinely get high grades in math. Now, this is interesting, right? Because those same exact kids, literally, the same kids from the same sample, perform below average for the developed world in math. So there's a disconnect between what we're telling kids, right, and how they're actually doing on an international measuring stick. Interestingly, even our top quartile, wealthiest kids, socioeconomically speaking, the kids with the best educated parents, with books and computers and all of the advantages, going to some of the most tricked out schools in the world, those kids perform below their affluent peers in 26 other countries in math. Again, this is in 10th grade on the PISA test of critical thinking in math, to be specific. That's a remarkable thing. So at every socioeconomic level, and even at every age level, you see this gap, really especially, again, in math and science. So one of the things that the kids noticed was that school was just more austere, a little bit more focused on school. And the most important piece of this, probably, the most important manifestation, was that school was harder. This is just a very simple thing. And it came up in all kinds of ways, including fewer A's on tests. But also, kids in other countries, and these countries in particular, tend to do a little less homework. Korea is an exception, and we'll talk about Korea. They tend to do less homework than many American kids. But the homework that they are doing is higher quality. It's more challenging. There was a Finnish exchange student who spent a year in Michigan. I don't want to talk too much about Finland, because I know you're very lucky to be hearing from Pasi Sahlberg shortly after this. So I'll leave Finland to him, because he is, in fact, Finnish. But she said that she couldn't believe how much homework she had, and it was all cutting and pasting and doing worksheets. And she said, I never had to think. They told me what to do. And you hear this a lot from exchange students. So it's the quality that's the problem, definitely not the quantity. So when I surveyed hundreds of exchange students about this, 9 out of 10 international students said US classes were just easier. And 7 out of 10 American exchange students agreed that US classes were easier. What does this all mean? I mean, you could do a graduate dissertation on what that may or may not mean. But looking around the world, one thing you can say is that most of the countries that have managed to dramatically improve their results have at some point huddled up, gotten over their differences, and agreed on a list of fewer, deeper, more rigorous targets for what kids should know at every grade level. That may sound familiar, because although they are not perfect, that is what the Common Core State Standards are designed to do. And I know they are controversial, but from my little window on the world, it is hard to imagine that this is not a prerequisite to having a world-class education system. Even though it's not perfect, and even though it will have to be changed, just like these standards are changed in every country in the world all the time, it adds a level of coherence, clarity, and rigor to a system that lacks all three. The next thing the kids noticed had to do with their teachers. They had plenty of good and bad things to say about their teachers abroad. One thing that they noticed was that their teachers generally did seem to have a little more respect than their teachers back home. That's a hard thing for a kid to measure. It's even a hard thing for teachers to measure on a self-report basis. But one thing we do know is that in places like Finland in particular, the kids know that it's as hard to get into education college in Finland as it is to get into MIT in the United States. This is a picture of a teacher I met in Finland at a school outside of Helsinki. It is actually, for Finland, quite diverse. A third of the kids are immigrants, many from refugees from places like Somalia. And this teacher was great, very funny, very well respected by the students, you could tell. But you know, the first time he applied to teacher college, he was rejected because his grades weren't high enough. But you're allowed to go off and do some things and prove that you're ready. So the next year he applied again. He was rejected. And the third year, after he did some substitute teaching and other things, he was accepted. Now, do I think this would have been a good teacher even if he was accepted on the first time? Definitely. But here's the thing I had underestimated. What I had underestimated about all this was the signaling effects of these decisions. Everyone in Finland knows, politicians, taxpayers, parents, kids, know how hard it is to even contemplate becoming a teacher. And that message makes all kinds of other things possible. Because you know, one thing that doesn't get talked about a lot is that Finland had its period of top-down accountability measures too. Finland had a period where teachers were not as trusted as they are now. Finland in 1968 consolidated all of its teacher training colleges, shut down a bunch of them, and moved them into the top 8 most elite universities. As it became harder and harder to become a teacher and more respected, eventually, teachers finally got the kind of autonomy that they needed to do their jobs well. Finland's equivalent of the Common Core state standards were 800 pages long in very small font until 1985. Teachers did not love it. But then they brought it down to 300 pages. And ever since, they've continued to try to make it clearer what the goals are, but give teachers more and more flexibility around the methods, which is true in every top-performing country in the world. So this is, again, something that matters. The signaling effects of decisions like this matter just as much as the fact that, yes, when you only accept the top 10 or 20% of applicants to ed school, you are going to have the advantage of students who themselves are very well educated, relatively speaking. But there's more to it than just that, which I think is interesting. What I'd like to do now is actually let Kim talk a little bit about what she noticed was a difference between her peers in Oklahoma and her peers at her high school in Finland. We can go ahead. Thank you.
I think everything that really people say about Finland is true. The food is better. The students here care more. They understand that it's important. They may not like a class, but they know if they don't pass it, then they don't pass their tests and it's harder to get to university, and like they see the reaction, how what they do now will affect them. It's more real to them. I feel like here they don't try to make it fun. They actually do have fun. And they don't try to make it incorporated into the classroom as a bribe. Like they don't say, okay, we'll have fun in this class as a bribe. They get their work done, they work, and it matters to them.
So this was something that Kim brought up to me again and again. And I, again, wouldn't have noticed it without her. But kids seem to buy into school, not only in Finland, but in Poland and Korea. Korea, the buy-in is maybe extreme. Korea is a place where kids go to school all day, and then 75% of 15-year-olds also go to after-school private tutoring of some kind or another until late at night, at which point many of them go home because there's a curfew on how late those prep academies, cram schools can be open. And then they continue studying through online lectures you can buy. And everyone you meet in Korea complains about this system. The kids, the teachers, the parents, the minister of education. And yet they feel powerless to stop it because the anxiety around getting a great test score and getting into a great university is so intense. This is true to varying degrees all over the world and should be a cautionary tale for the United States. There are ways to get to rigor that involve joy, right? And you can see that in Finland. You can see it in classrooms all around the United States, and you know it, and you've seen it. and so have I. But once you have a certain level of anxiety mixed with distrust in the public system, mixed with extreme rewards for elite certifications from certain universities, you are vulnerable to a shadow education system that plagues countries like Korea, Japan, India, Singapore, China, to varying degrees. We don't have anything approaching that level, but you see glimpses of it, don't you, right? With SAT prep, with other tutoring companies. And you know, tutoring is actually a great way to learn, probably the most effective according to some research. But it shouldn't be based on your ability to pay, and it should be the kind of learning that could happen in school. I want to save a few minutes for questions, but I want to just very quickly, before we end here, note one last thing that these kids noticed. And that is parents. They just assumed that the parents, as did I, that parents in these countries would be more involved in their kids' education. Because we know the more involved you are in your children's education, the better they do as a parent. But you know what you don't see in schools in Finland and Poland and Korea? You don't see parents. When I asked a Finnish woman with 2 kids in elementary school what her school asks her to do, she was confused by the question. And then she said, well, I have to bring my kids to school. That's important. And I said, oh, but you don't volunteer or do the PTA or fundraise or bake sales or... And she said, no, maybe we should. That sounds fun. And I was like, okay, come to my kids' school. But actually, there has been one study of this, and in 13 different countries and regions all around the world, they found something remarkable, which was the more time that parents spent reading to their little kids when they were young, and then talking to them about the news of the day, about books they were reading, about movies as they got older, the better their kids did by age 15 on a test of critical thinking and reading, regardless, even if you're after you control for socioeconomic impact, this is true. Maybe this isn't surprising to you. But they also found that the more time parents spent volunteering in the PTA and extracurricular activities at school, the worse their kids did by age 15 on the test of critical thinking and reading, even after controlling for socioeconomic status. So that was shocking, right? But one thing to just consider is that actually our parents are very involved compared to parents around the world. But they aren't involved in ways that typically lead to learning. Parents in the countries with the smartest kids in the world are involved in education at home. And they are very directly helped to do that by their school leaders and teachers. And that is the role that they serve. And this is a little secret that nobody really talks about, because those parents are force multipliers for the teachers. And it is something, though, that they have to be led to, because parents don't just naturally, organically know. I didn't know that when I read to my little kid, I'm supposed to ask him questions about what's happening. Maybe I should have, but I didn't until a kindergarten teacher at his public school in DC told me, and it took her 5 seconds. And it changed forever the way I read to my kid. But that kind of guidance and leadership, leading parents, is something that I think maybe gets underestimated a bit in our education reform debates. We talk about parental involvement, but it's not always clear what kind. And this is the theme that I'll leave you with before we open it up to questions here. There are many beautiful, exciting things going on in American schools. I didn't see anything anywhere in any other countries that I didn't think we could do as well or better or aren't already doing in some places. But one thing I did see is a lot of confusion, a lot of noise, a lot of mission fog and mission creep about what we are here for. And I didn't see that in these countries. So having a consensus around what we are here for, now that higher order skills matter to our kids' chances more than ever before, is going to be as important to us, I think, than almost anything else. Thank you so much for listening.
We'll take one question. So thank you so much, Amanda. Obviously, any conversation about our best teachers is a relative term, right? And we really spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the right relative term would be. Is it highly effective? Is it teachers of this certain standard deviation? And we ended up deciding to talk about world-class teachers because we are in a global economy and because our teachers are preparing our students for a competitive world moving forward. Now, we have time for one question for you. Apparently, we are making some progress on our technology, and there are some devices that work and others that don't. In an effort to avoid the digital divide at the Emerging Issues Forum, we are going to take a flashback moment, go old school. There are 4 mics in the room. One lucky person will get their hands first on one of those mics. Now, I feel the need to be a little bit transparent with you. At least 95% of the reason why we didn't use mics in the first place is because I don't trust y'all. I want to try to avoid the question that comes with a 30-minute speech, and the question at the end is, don't you agree with me? So, 4 IEI staff members walking around with mics. Where are you guys? Raise your hands. Do a little dance. Make sure people can see you out there. First person who gets a mic can ask a question. And I promise you, if you give a speech, I'm going to come off the stage and tackle you. Now. Got it? Yep. Go for it.
I'd like to change the conversation a little bit, maybe ask, how do we start defining and refocusing what we mean by smartest, success, effective, world-class? How do we have that discussion that talks about different ways of measuring and not always with the test?
Yeah, you know, you have to look at many different measurements, right? You don't want to just look at a test. I will say that I chose this test because it is different than any other standardized test I've ever seen. It isn't perfect, no test is. But this particular data that I'm referring to here throughout this conversation is really a test that was designed to assess your ability not to memorize information, but to apply it to solve problems you've never seen before, to make an argument, to use judgment, to make decisions without real clear information, the kinds of things that you and I have to do every day in our lives. So I took the PISA test, this is what I'm talking about, the PISA test, to make sure that was the case. And I could feel that I had to think. I had to write out answers. I had to address things that were complex, and there was no one right answer. In addition to that, you want to look at other things, like you said. I mean, there's obvious things you can measure around the world, like high school graduation rates. There are now 20 countries that have a higher high school graduation rate than we do. You can look at college attainment rates. We have a very strong college attainment rate still. You can look at other things, and you should look at other things. There was a really fascinating study, I wish there were more like this, done of the percentage of students who finish, you know how there's a survey sometimes attached to a standardized test, and it asks it doesn't count, it asks about, how many books do you have at home, and that kind of thing. So they found that it was incredibly predictive of how a whole country did, what percentage of kids finished the survey. So they went all the way through. And interestingly, most kids finish the survey, vast majority. Even though it doesn't count, it's for the PISA test, this random international test. It has no impact on their lives. But they almost all finished the survey. But small degrees of difference made huge degrees of difference in the country outcomes. And nobody knows why this is true, but the theory is that there's something about conscientiousness, about finishing what you do. Could also be there's something about, compliance. I mean, depending on how you look at it, that these kids are actually, finishing every question because that's what they do without thinking. But regardless, what you see all around the world is you actually see a connection between the kinds of non-cognitive skills that we know matter more than IQ, things like self-control, self-discipline, grit, and empathy. You see a connection between that and top-performing education countries. It's funny because people will come to me and say, I read a story for The Atlantic about how we maybe need to dial down the importance of sports in our high schools, which you can imagine made me lots of friends all over the country. And people will say to me, but this is where I learned, perseverance. And I learned how to fail in football. And I learned, about self-discipline. And I said, that's awesome. Why did you not learn that in math? Because guess what? Every kid takes math in America. And you have not seen a gritty kid until you have seen a Korean kid in a calculus class. I mean, for real. These kids are learning self-control, self-discipline, resilience, perseverance, all those great magical words in school. And you can learn them out of school, and I hope you learn them in both places. But I know that I got you for 6 to 8 hours a day in school. So it seems to me that those things are interrelated. Thank you so much for having me. Good luck with the rest of your conference.